The speaker today, I think most of you probably have heard before, or you already or know quite well, is our Director of Research, Dr. Samuel Gregg. Sam has written and spoken on a host of topics. He literally travels all over the world, lecturing on everything from the financial crisis to moral and legal and philosophical foundations of a free society. He is a great speaker, a prolific writer. We sometimes tease him that, during the breaks of a meeting, he goes and writes a book. We get coffee, and he writes a book. Jonathan Witt, one of our colleagues, asked him if he played sports to make him human. And since Grand Rapids, nothing is really more important in Grand Rapids than Dutch things, Dutch mints and sports. I will tell you that Sam actually did play sports before he started writing. So he is partially human, so it's good to know that. Sam oversees all of our research and all of the fellows and edits several of our series, including the Lexington Book Studies in Ethics and Economics. He's on the academic advisory boards of Campion College in Sydney, the Fundación Burke in Madrid, the Institute for Economic Affairs in London, as well as the editorial boards of the Journals of Markets Morality and Revista Valores of the Industrial Society. His books include On Ordered Liberty, his prize-winning book, The Commercial Society, The Modern Papacy, which you can get for only $130 from Continuum Press, so I highly recommend it. And his most recent book is on the Swiss economist Wilhelm Röpke on his political economy that was just released several months ago. A couple of announcements I have to make is that you can get all of those books and more at the Acton Bookshop right outside. So it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Sam Gregg. Thank you.
Thanks, Scott. Well, thank you, Michael. Thank you, Melissa, for organizing this. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming to listen to me today. As mentioned, actually, Michael didn't mention this, so let me say, my topic today is Europe's economic crisis, what went wrong, what will happen, and what it means for America. It's a topic I think has been on many of our minds since early this year when Americans and the rest of the world watched an entire European country, Greece, descend into economic chaos. Now, a week, it's often said, is a long time in politics, but much, however, can also change in a year. Only a short while ago, some European politicians were touting the European social model's superiority over what they often deride as Anglo-Saxon capitalism. Now, however, governments across Europe are scrambling to avoid the fate of Greece. Moreover, they're doing so by contemplating, and in some instances actually doing, the hitherto unthinkable. Reducing their budget deficits by reducing the expansive welfare states to which so many Europeans have so long been accustomed. And in doing so, these governments, I think, are finally acknowledging a truth that was obscured by the crisis of the euro. And the truth is this, that for all the disarray generated by the euro's recent tribulations, Europe's economic problems have much deeper causes. So, what happened? How is it that a continent which in 2009 seemed to have avoided the severity of America's economic recession has suddenly found itself now mired in economic crisis? How is it that so many people today are wondering whether the euro, seen in 2009 as the new currency strongman, will even exist in 5 years' time? How could it be that some first world European governments, Greece, Portugal, Spain, that for these countries, sovereign debt default is a real possibility? Now, like most economic questions, the answers are long and complicated, and the answers often have much less to do with economics than we sometimes realize. But today I want to do three things. First, I want to talk about what's happened to Europe's economies. Second, I want to outline how European countries are addressing these problems. And third, the third thing I want to do is suggest what this all might mean for America. Now, before I begin, I need to make a few caveats. The first is that, contrary to what you might think after this lecture, I actually like Europe. I even like Greece. I lived in Europe for many years. My wife and I did our doctorates in Europe. Some of my best friends are Europeans. And I firmly believe that the roots of all that's good in America, the roots are to be found in Europe. My second caveat is that while we often talk about Europe, the truth is there's actually many Europes and many different European economies. Finland is not Belgium. Belgium is not Ukraine. Ukraine is not Spain. And nowhere is like Greece. We also shouldn't conflate Central Europe with Western Europe, with Scandinavian Europe, with Eastern Europe, with Mediterranean Europe. These regions and their economies are all different from each other. Lastly, and this is important, I want to stress today that I'm not saying that all Europe needs to do to resolve its problems is to become exactly like America. America has more than its own fair share of its cultural, political, and economic problems. And as you'll discover, I also think there are several things some European governments are doing much better than America right now when it comes to dealing with their economic problems. So let's begin by addressing the first question I raised. How did Europe's economies descend so quickly into crisis? As I mentioned, the answer is complicated, but for simplicity's sake, let me divide the response into short-term causes and long-term causes. First, in the short term, it's now quite clear that many of the causes of America's 2008 financial crisis were also at work in Western Europe. It turns out, for instance, that Europe's financial sector was even sicker than America's. Europe's banking losses from the financial crisis, for example, are now 35% larger than America's. There was also a highly overvalued property market in Europe, especially in Britain and Spain. I think it's also true that a lot of the same irresponsible behavior by Americans that translated into high levels of personal, corporate, and government debt were just as present in Europe and just as facilitated by the problem of moral hazard. In other words, the implicit assumption was that if investments went bad, then the state would rescue those in trouble. And that, my friends, is a recipe for more irresponsible behavior. Now, perhaps the biggest difference between America and most European countries in this regard is that there was at least a debate in America about the economics and the morality of bailouts. In most European countries, no such debate even occurred. A second short-term problem is the reality that the euro, now in its 8th year of circulation, was partly built upon what we might politely call economic untruths. Now, it's true that since the euro entered circulation in 2002, some benefits have flowed from its adoption. The euro has helped some countries to integrate their financial markets. It's also reduced exchange rate risks as well as currency conversion costs. The creation of the European Central Bank with a clear mandate for fighting inflation has also helped countries with histories of monetary instability, Italy, Greece, Spain, and Portugal, to escape the inflation spirals to which they were so prone. But from the euro's very beginning, it was tarnished. It was tarnished by a fudging of public finances by European nations anxious to be admitted to the Eurozone. Let's remember, let's remember that countries seeking admission were required to have a budget deficit level of less than 3% of GDP and a debt ratio of less than 60% of GDP. Now, to meet this requirement, most governments employed what might be generously described as creative accounting. Indeed, they have actually admitted doing this. In 2004, for example, Greece's finance minister confessed, quote, "It has been proven that Greece's budget deficit never fell below 3% since 1999. In the end, most applicant countries were admitted to the euro despite having debt levels exceeding 60%. Italy and Belgium, for example, were permitted entry despite having debt ratios of over 120%. Now, what made the situation even worse was that European governments have continued openly to violate the rules that are supposed to bind all members of the euro. So today, the reality is that large countries in Europe can do just about anything they want when it comes to deficits. Now, of course, the effects of the financial crisis upon European economies and the euro were traumatic. But from another standpoint, their primary effect was simply to exacerbate deeper, more long-term problems with many European economies. I'm going to talk about 6 of these problems. And the first and most obvious long-term problem is the economic unsustainability of the European social model. So what do I mean by the European social model? In simple terms, I mean the following. Western Europe's post-war economies were shaped by an apparent concern for the economically marginalized and the desire to create more just societies. Now, these are noble ends. But in terms of economic policy, by the 1960s, these goals had been translated into extensive intervention into virtually every economic sector, extremely generous welfare states, and of course, the high levels of tax required to pay for these welfare programs. The difficulty, of course, is that over time, all these measures eventually produce economic stagnation. As the Czech president, Václav Klaus, observed this year, quote, "Average annual economic growth in the Eurozone countries was 3.4% in the 1970s, 2.4% in the 1980s, 2.2% in the 1990s, and only 1.1% between 2001 and 2009. A similar slowdown, Klaus added, has not occurred anywhere else in the world. A second long-term problem facing Europe's economies is Europe's profound demographic decline. On current projections, for example, Spain's over 65 population will increase from its present level of 17% to 25% by 2030. That means fewer people working to support growing numbers of pensioners. So when low economic growth and declining demography are combined with European welfare states, in other words, generous state-provided health and unemployment insurance, early retirement and liberal state pensions, large public sector employment, legislation that emphasizes job security over labor market flexibility, then something eventually has to give. Greece has reached that point. The rest of Europe is struggling to avoid following Greece into the abyss. There is, however, a third problem that's facilitated Europe's arrival at the economic crossroads, and it's this. For all the endless rhetoric about solidarity and social justice that drenches European political discussion, much of Western Europe's economic culture is characterized by a deeply unjust division. Modern European economies are increasingly divided between insiders and outsiders. The insiders are establishment politicians of the left and right, trade unions, public sector workers, politically connected businesses, pensioners, and those, such as farmers, receiving massive subsidies. The outsiders include, among others, entrepreneurs, immigrants, and worst of all, the young. Now, naturally, the insiders do everything they can to maintain their position, and they marginalize outsiders' opportunities for advancement. So how do Europe's insiders maintain the status quo? Well, first, we need to recognize that Western European governments are largely managed by a political class that transcends ideological divisions. In France, for example, the main political parties of left and right are dominated by people who studied at what are known as les grandes écoles, elite educational institutions that are very difficult to get into, but whose graduates supply most of France's business leaders, politicians, and civil servants. It's quite typical for a grande école graduate to work for a politically connected corporation, then switch to the civil service, then return to the private sector before eventually becoming, of course, a member of parliament. This is quite normal. Now, France is an extreme case, but this situation manifests itself all through Western Europe. Not surprisingly, the insiders, whatever their political differences, agree that they should be in charge. Indeed, Europe's political class is exceptionally good at perpetuating itself. It's common, for example, for European politicians' children to take the same road to power. Take Greece's current socialist prime minister, George Papandreou. His father and his grandfather were also Greek prime ministers. In America, not even the Bushes have managed that dynastic feat yet. The fourth long-term economic problem confronting Europe is the phenomenon of what the Nobel Prize economist George Stiegler famously called regulatory capture. European regulators invariably identify themselves with those they're supposed to regulate, sometimes literally in return for jobs in a post-regulator life. They consequently work very hard to limit competition from new businesses or entrepreneurs. And this is a manifestation of a fifth profound economic disorder: the willingness of European insiders to use state power to keep European outsiders marginalized. European trade unions, for example, could care less about immigrants or the unemployed. Instead, they spend most of their time pressuring governments to make it very hard for companies to fire anyone, especially union members. Employers are consequently very reluctant to hire. Many young Europeans and recent immigrants are thus condemned to a life of cobbling together part-time contracts with no prospect of a full-time job or benefits. But perhaps the biggest and sixth problem facing Europe's economies is one of attitude. It's not as if Europe's outsiders, for instance, are clamoring for labour market liberalisation. No, when Paris's streets were hit by student riots in 2006, the protests were against relatively minor efforts to liberalise France's highly inflexible labour market. Likewise, Spain's overall 20% unemployment rate and its 40% youth unemployment rate has not been greeted by widespread demands by young Spaniards for labour market reform. No, instead the demand is for the same permanent job security already enjoyed by the impossible-to-fire crowd. Now, no doubt the widespread refusal by so many European politicians and citizens to address these 6 problems reflects their reluctance to concede that the post-war European effort to use the state to provide as much economic security as possible has encountered an immovable object in the form of economic reality. But it's also arguable, albeit very politically incorrect to do so, that it also reflects the workings of a potentially deadly nexus between democracy on the one hand and the welfare state on the other. Now, we all know that one justification for democracy is that it provides us with ways of holding governments accountable and aligning government policies with the citizens' wishes. But what happens when some citizens begin viewing these mechanisms as a means for encouraging elected officials to use the state to provide them with whatever they want, such as apparently endless economic security? And what happens when many elected officials believe it's their responsibility to provide the demanded security, or, more cynically, regard welfare programs as a useful tool for creating constituencies that can be relied upon to vote for them? The end result shouldn't surprise anyone. A spiral of expanding welfare that neither politicians nor the growing number of welfare beneficiaries have any desire to stop until things become so unmanageable that there's no alternative. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to modern Greece. Now, we all know that all societies have their elites. The real question is whether a society embodies the possibility of social mobility through hard work in opportunity. And this is what makes modern Europe's endless justice rhetoric so distasteful. Because all of Europe's tedious solidarity talk and its social justice speak essentially masks a social division based upon the highly unjust foundation of proximity, of closeness to government power. A situation which incentivizes everyone to join the daily struggle to obtain state-mandated privileges. Now, perhaps what's most dispiriting about all of this is that many European politicians do understand the reality of these long-term problems. They do understand what's going on. Of course, there are some, such as Spain's uber-leftist Prime Minister Zapatero and Greece's socialist Prime Minister Papandreou, who try to blame unnamed speculators and who hint at foreign conspiracies. I'm not joking. Foreign conspiracies to explain away the problems to populations who are often very inclined to blame other people for their problems. But let's keep in mind here, the barriers to change are not economic, they're political. And most European politicians understand this all too well. Luxembourg's Prime Minister, Jean-Claude Juncker, put it best when he said, quote, "We all know what to do, but we don't know how to get re-elected once we have done it," end quote. In short, any significant attempt at economic reform risks alienating particular voting blocs. And this may be enough to ensure a reforming government's defeat at the next election. And that's precisely what happened to Gerhard Schröder's Social Democrat Green coalition government in Germany after it implemented welfare reforms between 2003 and 2005. So, let's move to part 2 of my presentation, which is to ask, what's likely to happen? Well, the good news is that some European governments have decided they have to do something. At the June G20 summit in Canada, for example, several European governments made it very clear to the Obama administration that they don't believe you can spend your way out of recessions. Unlike America, countries such as David Cameron's Britain and Angela Merkel's Germany have chosen the politically risky but economically brave path of austerity and public sector spending cuts. Even so, many European governments are proceeding down the reform path with barely disguised reluctance. In France, for example, President Sarkozy's reform measures presently consist of raising the official retirement age from 60 to 62. That will not strike many people as a radical reform. By contrast, Spain's Zapatero, to give him credit, is cutting pensions, civil servants' wages, and social programs. He's also promised labour market reform, something that the IMF has identified as desperately needed in Spain. But at the same time, Zapatero shows no willingness to force reforms past the unions. He'll do what he has to do, but always the minimum and without enthusiasm. More generally, however, I believe there are three long-term developments Europe's current economic problems are turning into a reality. The first, which isn't just economically important, but which is also historically and politically important, is that the days of the EU being essentially a Franco-German affair are over. As the debate over whether to rescue Greece demonstrated, the cold, hard reality is that Germany is the power that counts the most today in Europe. 20 years after German reunification, Germany is flexing its economic muscle as the EU's paymaster, and it sees less and less reason why it should be told what to do by other European countries that have driven themselves close to economic Armageddon. This tension is highlighted by the fact, and heightened by the fact, that Germany is one of the few EU states to have implemented successful economic reforms over the past 10 years. Since 2002, Germany has partially liberalized its labor market. It's even passed a constitutional amendment for a balanced budget. Imagine that, a balanced budget by 2016. Amid Europe's sluggish economies, Germany actually has booming exports. German workers are actually postponing their vacations. Imagine that. Europeans actually postponing their vacations to work and therefore to earn more. The unemployment rate in Germany today is 7.5%. That's less than America's, and it's also falling. Unfortunately, most other Eurozone economies are in a very difficult position because, unlike Germany, they didn't make the appropriate changes. And this leads us to the second long-term effect of Europe's economic problems. This is a growing division within the EU when it comes to economic policy. On the one hand, there are countries like Germany and the Scandinavian countries who want stricter limits on government spending. They want more guarantees of the European Central Bank's independence and more internal reforms to make Europe more competitive. On the other hand, there's another grouping within the EU. I like to call this Club Med. Portugal, Spain, Greece, France, Italy. Far from being willing to reform the European social model, they actually want more EU subsidies. They want a European-wide minimum wage. They want a less independent European Central Bank. And they want what they call more extensive, quote, European economic government. That, ladies and gentlemen, is code word for corporatism. In other words, the cozy, corrupt world of the insiders that's driven so many European economies into the ground. For the foreseeable future, this division between economic reformers and corporatists will be the fundamental division in the politics of the European Union. There is, however, a third long-term issue that I think in many ways overshadows all these questions. In economic terms, Europe's ability to escape the Great Recession's effects is going to require a lot more than just spending cuts. The only long-term way out is economic growth, wealth creation. Here, however, all of Europe faces a problem most non-European countries don't. And the challenge is one of an overall population decline combined with a rapidly aging population. As the IMF said in 2006, quote, "The population of the 25-member EU in coming decades is set to become smaller and much older, posing significant risks to potential economic growth and putting substantial upward pressure on public spending." However you examine the statistics, the demographic picture for Europe is bleak. Statistically speaking, the number of births per woman required to simply maintain a population size is 2.1 children. Not a single European country meets that figure today. Germany's birth rate, for example, is 1.38. Italy's 1.41. Spain's is 1.39. Now, France and Britain are doing comparatively well at 2.0 and 1.94 respectively. But you guessed it, Greece's birth rate is the lowest in the entire European Union. Now, the reasons for these trends are many. The 20th century's two world wars tore large generational holes in Europe's demographic landscape. Women are also having children later in life. There also seems to be broad correlations between increasing material prosperity and diminishing population growth. And there is the greater access to contraception and abortion from the 1950s onwards. But I think more subtle cultural factors are also at work. For one thing, it's striking how many Europeans are reluctant to even discuss the subject of population decline. Now, this may owe something to an association of calls to have more children with the population policies of totalitarian regimes such as Stalin's Russia and Hitler's Germany. Another factor may be many Europeans' susceptibility to population growth alarmism. This is manifested in many European governments' aggressive promotion of population control in developing countries, which, for the record, I think verges on neo-colonialism. At a deeper level, however, Europe's declining birth rate also reflects a change in horizons. Because if your cultural outlook is focused on the present and disinterested in the future, then children are much more likely to be regarded as a burden rather than as a gift. Individuals and societies that have lost a sense of connection to their past and seem to have no particular interest in their long-term destiny aren't likely to be worried about a lack of children. Now, immigration is one way for European countries to escape these conundrums. After all, it's proved to be one of America's engines of economic growth, and it continues to help America avoid the population trap in which Europe now finds itself. For decades, Western Europe relied on immigration, especially from Islamic countries, for cheap labor, particularly for those unpleasant jobs some Europeans just don't want to do. For the moment, however, increased immigration doesn't appear to be an option for Europe. The policies of multiculturalism have failed and produced such a deep ethnic division in many European societies that most European governments are presently reducing immigration from non-European countries. So is demography destiny? Not necessarily. Demography is only one variable among many. Moreover, individuals, families, and nations can make choices, and choices change our future. The clock, however, is ticking. The longer Europeans fail to address their demographic difficulties, the smaller becomes their room for maneuver, and the more likely Europe will be reduced to being a minor player on the world stage. And that brings me neatly to the third and last part of this lecture. What does this all mean for America? Well, I suspect some of you have already guessed what some of the implications might be, so let me identify what I think are the three most significant. The first, I think, is that unless European countries make some fundamental changes to their economic culture, then Europe is simply going to be less and less important to the United States, both politically and economically. The rise of India and China as economic, political, and military powers has already resulted in a major shift in the outlook of American entrepreneurs, investors, and politicians away from Europe and towards Asia. Second, if Europe's population continues to shrink and age while America's population continues to grow steadily, then this means that when it comes to the geopolitical group that we call the West, Europe is just going to matter less and less. There will simply be many more Americans around and fewer Europeans. The third consequence, I think, for America is that Europe provides us with a living, breathing case study of how interventionist policies and big welfare programs can, especially when they're mixed with a certain culture of democracy, drive entire countries to the brink of economic collapse. At the same time, the response of some European countries, such as Britain, to their economic problems, provides America with some guidance about how to address these problems in a lasting way. My only regret is that many of the Americans presently holding the levers of political power don't seem very interested in these lessons and in fact are propelling America in exactly the opposite direction. So, to conclude, from what I've said today, you might think that I believe democracy is part of Europe and America's problems. You would, however, only be half right and therefore wrong to think so. What Europe has shown us is that it's not democracy per se that's the problem. Rather, it's a certain culture of democracy, mixed with expansive welfare programs and aging populations that can propel entire nations to the very edge of insolvency. And let me define very clearly the type of democratic culture I have in mind. It's one in which neither politicians nor citizens have any hesitation in using democratic mechanisms to allow 51% of the population to loot the other 49%. So, does this mean that reducing deficits and shrinking the welfare state requires a diminishment of democracy? The answer is no. Most authoritarian regimes, ranging from Hitler's Germany to Chavez's Venezuela, have proved more than willing to use generous welfare programs to buy off large segments of the population. Instead, the beginning of a proper response is to recognize that a democracy's ability to resist the long slouch towards the soft despotism of the welfare state requires two things. First, Europeans and Americans need to shift the incentives for economic mobility and security so that they lie in the private sector rather than in becoming a recipient of government welfare. Now, this task is going to be very difficult because so many people already enjoy some measure of state income, and I suspect they won't give it up without a fight. It's further complicated by the fact that, at least in America, there are efforts afoot today to shift the incentives in exactly the opposite direction. Yet I think this problem is dwarfed by the immensity of the second challenge. The need for Europeans and Americans to develop a moral, political, and economic culture which understands the wrongness of politicians and citizens using the state to live at other people's expense. Now, if opinion polls are correct, it may well be, culturally speaking, it's too late for a lot of Europe. After all, the modern European welfare state goes back to the late 19th century. Far too many Europeans now simply assume a very large, a very generous welfare state as part of the economic landscape. Indeed, when you think about it, you quickly realize that the increasing number of older and aging Europeans today have no incentive to change. Their attitude might be described as après moi, le déluge. America, however, I think, is a different story. The sheer intensity of resistance to the Obama administration's healthcare legislation was about many things. But it surely reflected the fact that millions of Americans are simply not willing to go the way of Western Europe. Successful long-term resistance, however, is going to depend upon more Americans understanding that the link between democracy and the welfare state must be broken. And the only way to achieve this objective over the long term is through recommitting America to some of the very best aspirations of its founding. A love of liberty, an embrace of the virtues needed to sustain freedom, and an unwillingness to delegate to the state the responsibilities that free men and free women do owe to each other. The long-term fate of the Republic, ladies and gentlemen, may well depend on it. Thank you.